All right, we just got reconnected. What's up, Point Fighter Live? My name is Jackson Rudolph. I'm a member of Team Paul Mitchell Karate and founder of the Flow Weapons Training System. And today we're going to be breaking down some strategies as well as some bow staff techniques. Now, some of you that may have read the caption of this video or just heard me say that we're going to be working on strategies might be a little bit confused by that, right? Because for point fighters, as this is Point Fighter Live, strategy is pretty obvious. You got to have a strategy for your matchup whenever you're going into a fight. However, it's important for forms and weapons competitors to have strategy too. And I'm going to talk about strategy in two different ways. Instead of just talking about strategy, we're also going to be covering some techniques. We're going to be talking about some of my favorite ways to do releases, throwing the bow in the air both vertically and horizontally. And then by the end of the session today, we're going to cover some of my favorite signature moves. So first things first, we're going to start by talking about strategy. Now, strategy in a general sense is important, particularly for weapons competitors, because in many leagues, if we drop our weapon, we're either going to get a major downgrade on our score, or on NASCA, which is the circuit that I primarily compete on, you actually get disqualified for dropping the weapon. So it's very important to make sure that you're doing an impressive routine with a lot of difficulty, but that you're not risking so much that there's a high chance that you're going to drop and take that disqualification, which is not what anybody wants to happen, right? And so when I go into a tournament, I typically have 4 or 5 different versions of the same routine, so that, let's say I've got competitor A and B, and competitor A and B are my two top competitors. They're the top contenders that are trying to beat me, right? I have a form plan for if competitor A and B both hit. I've got a plan for if only competitor A hits and competitor B doesn't, vice versa, or if neither of them hit, what am I going to do? Because the other thing is, you never want to take out too much of your difficulty and then lose to somebody that you shouldn't lose to because you played it safe. Now, one important thing to remember is that if you overthink your strategy, you're going to wind up, giving routines that you're not going to be proud of, right? So one thing that I actually heard the legendary promoter and coach Joe Greenhall recently say in an interview that he did is that he noticed that, in a lot of my performances, he's had times where he was judging and I was the only competitor left in the division because everybody else dropped, and I would still go out and throw my full routine, right? And for me, it's because at that point, I'm still trying to make sure that I'm improving my craft. I still want to be testing myself. I didn't train all that time to just show up to the tournament and not do any of my tricks, right? So even though I'm talking a lot about strategy right now and when you should take things out and when you shouldn't, that does not mean that you can overthink it or play it too safe. It's always good to have your plan that you go out there and you execute. But we're not going to spend this whole workshop talking about strategy that you can only use when you're at a tournament, because who knows when the next time we're going to be able to show up to a tournament is, right? So instead, I'm going to talk about strategy in form building and in combo building and in selecting your moves. And I'm going to use a very specific striking example. Now, I know that a lot of you that are tuning in may want to learn some of my bow staff tricks, and we're definitely going to get to that, but I believe that the strikes are the most important element of a weapons form. If you don't have the good, clean basics, it doesn't matter how many cool tricks you can do, you're not going to be able to be successful. And so one of the most common striking techniques that we get into as a pose or as a big power move is the reverse thrust. And the reverse thrust can be done in a lot of different ways. You have the high reverse thrust, you have the regular normal reverse thrust on the straight line, then you also have the low reverse thrust. Some people come out of this like a stomping technique to rechamber the bow, things of that nature. However, the reverse thrust, although it's a very common technique and it's a very powerful technique that people use in their performances, there's a very limited number of ways that you can transition out of this technique. Part of that is because it takes a lot to set up this technique. It takes a lot to get into it. Normally, when I'm setting up a reverse thrust, I'm starting in a right leg front stance. I do a right side over the head strike. I've got to step the left leg up as I do the left side over the head strike, shifting my hips on the side strike. That right side strike is setting my line so I can have a nice straight chamber and then be able to execute the thrust. And sure, there's other variations of that, right? Maybe I just shift directly into that left side strike. But the key is I always need this right side strike to set up my proper angle so I can pull the bow straight back and execute that thrust. Or if I'm doing a low thrust, that would be a low side strike, pulling on the straight line, executing the thrust. The biggest mistake that you can make with a reverse thrust is not chambering on a straight line. For example, I see some people going from like a left side strike and they'll pull this like big circular chamber. They'll pull the bow all the way across and then thrust. It's too slow and it's not proper technique. That chamber should be boom, straight back on a straight line, right back into your target. So you're going to need that right side strike to set it up. Because of the fact that you need an extra strike to set it up, that's part of what makes it difficult to get out of. I'm in a reverse front stance most of the time because this is a defensive technique. I've got a lot of my weight on my bent knee, on my back leg, and I'm extending this thrust here. A couple of common ways that I see people get out of it are pretty generic. I see a lot of shifts to a side strike, so that you can just go into a strike combo from here, shift it back the other way to an over the head strike. Because you're supposed to have a pretty good balance of blocking and striking in your form, I see a lot of people that will shift and go into like a block from this position. But really, the block is such a unique move in bow staff that if you do that too many times in your form, it can start to stick out like a sore thumb and be really repetitive. You really only want to have that technique about once per form, but because of these different angles, you may have a high thrust in one part of your form, or a low part or a regular thrust in another part of your form, and you need to know the most dynamic way to be able to transition out. So we haven't even gotten to the transition out of it yet, and already you can start to understand how complex this basic technique really is, both the setup to get into the technique as well as the transition coming out of the technique. So now I'm going to give you the strategy that I use to best transition out of this technique, and it comes from a pretty unconventional strike. Normally when we do a forward strike, the right leg is going to lead the way. Bow staff is a long weapon, it's a distance weapon. We're all about trying to maximize the space between myself and my opponent. So typically when I do a forward strike, I want that right leg stepping out so I can cover that ground and try to get as much extension on my forward strike as possible without overcommitting, of course. So it's somewhat unconventional to throw forward strikes with the left leg leading the way, but it's one of the best transitions that you can use to get out of this reverse thrust position. So let's say we're in this reverse thrust. We're just going to do a normal one, but it could be at any angle. From this position now, I can shift my hips. My right hand is right here, just as if I was in a fighting stance, ready to throw my punch. It's the exact same position. I've got both these hands up. It's practically in guard right here. So I'm hitting this reverse thrust, and I'm just going to throw that right hand like a cross as I shift my body and throw the forward strike. Boom! That fires straight out on that line. I'm getting rotational power from my hips, and like I said, I'm going from that guard with the extension of the punch. So it's already a chamber for my forward strike. Keep in mind that forward strikes we can only do in certain parts of the form because typically we have to chamber and then throw the technique. It's not like our up, down, side, sides or our over the head strikes that can just come out of nowhere. The forward strike has to be chambered. When I'm in my reverse thrust, that's one of the rare occasions during a bow staff form that I'm already in almost a forward strike chamber position. So even though my left leg's in front, I can still fire that forward strike coming straight across the body. But the strategy of doing the forward strike is not just because it happens to be a good move that fits there. It's because of all the things that I can do out of it. Whenever I'm building a new combo or a new section or even a new full form, I'm always trying to think of, if I get to position A, how am I going to get to position B and position C? I don't want to ever put myself in a situation where I'm doing a strike or a technique or a pose or a trick that has me stuck. Being stuck is the worst thing in the world, especially when you're trying to be creative and choreograph into routine. So if I go to the forward strike, this is a very versatile technique. There's a lot of different things that I can do, and I'm going to demonstrate some of those. If we wanted to go the generic route of just continuing the strike combo like I mentioned earlier, you could. You could go from that reverse thrust, the forward strike across the body happens, you can hit an up, down, side, side combo across the body, you could go from the forward strike to an over the head. You have those options as well. However, typically a reverse thrust is a combo finisher. We're doing some type of complicated strike combo, and then we've got that big pause on the reverse thrust. So in a creative weapons form, or an extreme or a musical weapons form, you're typically going to want to transition right into your tricks from that big, powerful strike. So how do I do that? Once I've hit this forward strike position, forward strike is a notoriously good spot to do a figure eight from, because I can get a ton of power on the figure eight. Once again, this is where strategy comes into play. I'm putting myself in the best possible position for the next technique. If I'm in a forward strike, this left hand, normally a figure eight, I start in the middle so I can get as much speed as I've trained to be able to develop with my figure eight technique. But now check this out. If I'm in a forward strike, this left hand's at the bottom. I'm going to get a lot more leverage this way. So now my left hand can lift up, and then I'm pushing from the bottom of the bow. The amount of torque, the amount of leverage that I have here is insane. And I can use that to push an even faster figure eight. I can use that figure eight to get me into another striking combination, Or for the purposes of today's session, I can use that figure 8 to kickstart a behind the back pass, which is going to take me into pretty much any type of bow staff trick that you could ever want to do. I was teaching, we did a charity event trying to set the record for the world's largest class, and I was teaching with legendary point fighter Raymond Daniels here about a week ago. And one thing that Raymond was saying, he was teaching kind of Raymond's legendary signature jump spinning side kick technique. And one of the things that Raymond said was so important about that technique is not just how powerful it is and not just how effective it is, but the fact that once you land the technique, or even if you miss the technique, because of the spin and because of the execution of the kick, even if you hit somebody's guard, you've created space. So now you have room to operate, you have options on what you can do next. It's the same thing with this example in a bow staff form. If I go with the forward strike and then I can use that left hand being down low to push my figure 8, I've given myself more options. Whether I wanted to do a release next, whether I wanted to do a body roll next, whether I wanted to do a strike combo next, I've given myself a way to get into those combinations by throwing the forward strike and by following it up with the figure 8. One thing you might be noticing is that I'm doing this forward strike off to my left, which, by the way, if I'm saying left and right and it looks weird, it's because Facebook Live has a weird screen mirroring thing. So listen to what I say, not necessarily what you see as far as directions go. So notice that I'm doing the forward strike across my body to the left side, and then I'm doing the figure 8 to my right side. There's two reasons for this. Number one, more power equals more speed. If I'm going from this position, not only do I have the increased leverage from the bottom of the bow, but I also have my hips that can turn and give me increased rotational energy, shifting my hips and pushing, driving in to that figure 8. More powerful figure 8 is always going to be a faster figure 8. The other reason for that is that when I'm doing that left leg front stance, if I try to figure 8 here, sometimes that left leg, as it just did, can get in the way because the knee is bent. It can get in the way of the pass behind the back. So one of the reasons that I always shift to my right side for that figure 8 is so that I'm not hitting the left leg, but it also gives me a lot more power in the technique. Now, I talked about doing strike combos out of the reverse thrust, using this forward strike across the body. I talked about using this forward strike across the body to do figure 8 transitions to get into tricks or really any type of bow staff technique that you want, but there's even more than that. So once again, the entire purpose of doing this figure 8 is to give you options. Or I'm sorry, the forward strike. The entire purpose of the forward strike is to give you options. So once I've done this reverse thrust, I do the forward strike, what's another option? Well, we talked about this leverage I get from the bottom of the bow. From this position, my right hand really doesn't have to move much. I can lift this left hand up to about head level, and then I can push this straight across this way. That will set up a beautiful hand roll, and I can use that hand roll for a number of different types of combinations. I can go from this forward strike, push that hand roll, take that into a release from behind my back. I can go from this forward strike, use that hand roll, setting up a swinging combo, going the opposite direction off of the spin. I can use that hand roll to set up some type of other body roll, like a shoulder roll. I can use that hand roll to set up some type of more creative technique, like a punch under the bow to wrap around my neck and then go into a striking combo. So what I'm trying to demonstrate is, when you're combo building, don't just think of what move you want to do next. Think about what move will enable you to have the most options next. Let's say that you want to set up a 720 spin release, or you want to set up a kicking combination, and this isn't just a bow staff lesson. This is something that is true for every weapon, for every single creative martial artist that's going to be choreographing your own routine. You always want to give yourself options, and that's my primary strategy whenever I'm developing my own routines. Now, that's all that I've got for strategy today, going off of that reverse thrust, going into the forward strike. And I keep referencing releases, 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 because releases are one of my favorites. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the two main types of bow staff releases, and that's also going to set us up to work on one of my signature moves known as the Chris Angel, which we're going to get to very shortly. When we talk about bow staff releases, I like to talk a lot about quarterbacks. I have a really good analogy to NFL quarterbacks, right? Picture this. Let's say you're watching a football game and, quarterback has a great game, throws for 500 yards, 5 touchdowns, whatever, right? Crazy good game, right? And let's say that there's a receiver who also had a spectacular game, right? Let's say the receiver caught 4 of the touchdowns and went for, 250, 300 yards. An incredible game for a receiver, right? Who's most likely going to get the MVP? Most of the time, it'll be the quarterback. Even though it's probably a more exceptional game for a receiver, more often than not, the quarterback's getting the MVP. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that, right? The quarterback has to run the offense. The quarterback is responsible for audibles to change the play, things like that. But at the very basis of what the role of the quarterback is and what the role of the wide receiver is that if the quarterback's passing is perfect, if the quarterback can deliver the ball exactly where it's supposed to be, the receiver's job is a whole lot easier. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with martial arts? Well, when you're doing weapons, when you're doing any type of weapons release, you act as both the quarterback and the receiver. So your goal with your passing is to make your catching easy, right? So I'm going to say that again. The most important part, the reason we call it a release, is because the release is the difficult part. If you can master the release and make the release spot on, then you know the bow will always be in the same place at the same time, so that the catch of the release becomes automatic. Now, quarterbacks also have two different types of throws they use, two different main types of throw, right? You can't always just drop back and throw the ball as hard as you can. Sometimes you've got to have more finesse. You've got to lob the ball up over the defense, right? And in bow staff, we have two throws just the same. We have our fast, speedy throws using the butterfly spin setup where we launch the bow up into the air with some speed. But we also have the lob passes, which are going to be more the horizontally rotating releases, such as the box cutter, which we're going to cover. Those releases are not supposed to spin as fast because of the nature of the throw. So there's some of the, I guess that's even some strategy as well there. Do you want a slower release for a change of pace? So you would use the horizontal lob type release using the quarterback analogy. Or do you want a faster, harder hitting release that you're going to use in a combo, which would be the vertically rotating release or the bullet pass, going back to the quarterback analogy. Let's break down both of these techniques. Now, I like to do the vertical release from a butterfly spin setup. So I'm going to break down the butterfly spin very quickly first. You're going to start with your left hand in a thumbs up position. Once again, because I know that screen mirroring can mess up the angles, just listen to what I'm saying about the directionality. I know that I'm saying the right thing, even if you may see something slightly different. So you're going to start in your left hand, your non-dominant hand, with a thumbs up. You're going to go thumbs down and pass behind the back. And when you pass behind the back, with any bow step technique, it's very important to make sure you've got your thumbs pointing in towards each other. That is extremely important to have flow in your transitions. So once you've got both thumbs pointing in towards each other, my right hand's going to come out with my thumb staying down. Do not try to turn that wrist over yet. Keep the thumbs down position. You bring that bow to the front of your body, and now you're going to rotate all the way over until that palm is facing up, and the bow should be in between the index finger and the thumb. And once you've gotten to that position with the bow between the index finger and the thumb, you're going to take that left hand, palm up, and this is where the move gets its name. I'm going to slide that left hand on top, making that butterfly formation right there. So the left hand's on top of the right. I've made my butterfly. That's why we call this a butterfly spin. Once you make that butterfly, that right hand's going to come off the bow. Notice I bring that back to a nice chamber position there. I grab with the left, and this is a repeating technique, so I can do this technique over and over again. I pass behind the back, thumbs in towards each other. One more slow breakdown. The bow's going to come out to the right side, thumbs down. We go in front of the body, rotate all the way over until the palm is facing up. And then if you're an instructor, this might be a tip that's helpful for your students. A little funny thing that I like to say is, you want to make sure that left hand is palm up and makes the butterfly. A couple of common mistakes is I see people do this, where they try to like turn their palm up all the way this way and reach their hand like this. That's an ugly butterfly. That's a moth. We don't want that one, right? The other thing that I see is people just try to slap this hand right on top of the other one. That's a caterpillar, not a butterfly. You want to make sure that you've got that left hand on top, making that nice pretty butterfly formation. Once you've got that butterfly, right hand comes back to the chamber, left hand grabs, and you're good to go. Now, even though this is taught in steps, when students begin working on this, you want to make sure that you're not doing it in a robotic fashion. You don't want to do it step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, because that will make your technique choppy. When you start trying to go faster, it'll still just kind of be in all those steps and it won't look right. When you start learning this technique, you memorize those steps and you never ever stop moving. I continue my motion the entire time. Pass from one hand to the other, behind the back. And notice, I can pay attention to every detail without stopping the motion of the bow as long as I go nice and slow. Thumbs down, thumbs towards each other, thumbs down, rotate, make the butterfly, switch to my left. And then as you get more comfortable, you start to build the speed. And I'm not going to change the technique here at all. I'm just going to pick up speed. That's the exact same technique. Butterfly spin, simply passing from one hand to the other, never releasing the bow. That also shows you how the mastery of a technique can take something that looks very basic and very trivial to something that looks exceptional. And that's another very important part of performance. Now, what does that have to do with the release? How do we actually use that to release? Well, you could do a release by just holding the bow out in front of you, turning your wrist over, making a hitch. That is the definition of a release, right? But I think you'd much rather do a faster release with a lot more velocity. To do that, you're going to use that butterfly spin setup. All the speed that I just demonstrated on the butterfly spin can be translated into the release. Check this out. Go ahead and start from that behind the back position, both thumbs pointing in towards each other. Once you've got those thumbs pointing in towards each other, your right hand can come out to the right side, you bring it to the front. This is just the same as the butterfly spin. Where it gets different is where I would normally switch to my left hand. Check this out. I'm going to rotate all the way over till that palm is facing up, bow is in between the index finger and the thumb. But this time, instead of that left hand coming in to make that butterfly, I'm going to let the bow keep going. The bow's going to keep rotating. Pretend my left hand's not touching. I'm just going to do this for stability. The bow's going to keep rotating. I'm going to curl these right fingers in so that now the bow is resting only on my thumb there. I'm going to wait till the bow levels out, and I'm going to push the bow straight up with this right thumb. My thumb is going to act as a launching pad for the bow. So watch this in slow motion. I go from behind the back, I rotate all the way to the thumb and push. And notice when I go slow, there's not much rotation because there's not much momentum. This is a momentum-based release. So you want to try to maintain your speed throughout the entire technique. One of the old school ways of doing releases was to use the hand roll technique and then go into the throw. Hear me out. When I go from behind the back, when this right hand's coming around, look at this. I got a ton of torque right here. There's a ton of potential energy right here. When I go into this roll, if I do the hand roll version, I'm using up all of that potential energy, and then I'm throwing the bow with whatever's left over just by turning my wrist. What if I could get all of that same rotation and not lose any of that potential energy? What if I could make it 100% kinetic energy that goes into my release? When I've got those thumbs behind the back, the bow comes out, watch this. I'm getting all the same rotation that I would on a hand roll, but now it's all going to my thumb. The bow never has to stop moving. I push it into the air, and I make a nice, clean, controlled catch with the right hand or the left hand. Depends on what technique you want to be executing next. So once again, slow motion. I've got thumbs behind the back, thumbs pointing in towards each other. I come around in all one motion. I roll to the thumb and then push off. Now, other than speed, there are a couple of more benefits to why you should always throw with the thumb, and this is where I'm going to take our discussion of this new technique all the way back to our discussion of strategy. I'll ask you guys first. Go ahead and think for a second, maybe drop it down in the comments if you think that you know. Why would we want to push the bow off of the thumb other than just getting faster? What could potentially be another reason that we would do that? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. And now I'll give you a hint. Think about directionality. Think about directionality. Think about movement. Those are a couple of words that might be good tips. 3, 2, 1. So now I'm going to go ahead and tell you, now that you had a chance to think about it a little bit. So when we're doing a bow staff form, particularly bow staff trick combos, one thing that's important to remember is we want to maintain movement, right? I consider myself a sport karate historian. I've been watching film of sport karate for years, dating all the way back to the early 90s. And one thing that I notice about a lot of bow forms from the 90s and into the early 2000s is they're either stationary or they move in a straight line coming right up to the front. Even some of the early bow forms that started to include a couple of releases and body rolls still, the combos, the trick combos would kind of happen in one place and then they would move forward or what have you, right? So one thing that I try to instill in my performances is movement, using up the entirety of the ring using these bow staff tricking combinations. So if I'm just turning my wrist over and letting go of the bow, right? The directionality of the throw is based solely upon my timing. So if I'm here and I let go a little early, right, letting go at about this angle, the bow's going to go off to the left. If I'm rotating and I let go a little bit late, letting go on this angle, the bow's going to go a little bit to the right. And then if I let go right on time, the bow will go straight up in the center. But that's relying on timing, and timing is not something that's very reliable because nobody's timing is perfect 100% of the time, right? So instead what I like to do is I use this thumb release, because with my thumb, as long as I'm pushing the bow up whenever it gets to my thumb, the bow's gonna go straight. I change the directionality of the throw by just pushing my thumb in a different direction. If I push my thumb off to the left, the bow will go left. If I push my thumb off to the right, the bow will go right. And this is extremely helpful when I'm trying to create combinations, right? Let's say that I'm on this side of the ring and I want to do a bow staff throw combination and gradually move over to the other side of the ring, right? What I might do is, let's say I'm doing my striking combination over here. Maybe I do a reverse thrust so I can use my forward strike and figure eight to effectively transition out of it. Once I've got that figure eight, let's say maybe the only move that I've got in my toolbox right now is just my release, but I still want to show off that movement. I could go ahead and take a few steps to the side, going right, left, right, like a grapevine or karaoke type step. I can use that footwork, throw the bow with my right hand, and make my movement all the way to the other side of the frame, as you see here. But that only works if I can put my throw in the perfect spot. If I'm not consistent with the directionality and the timing of my throw, if I'm not a good bow staff quarterback, then my catch, being a receiver, is going to be a lot more difficult. So I want to be able to put that bow exactly where I want it to go, so that when I do the footwork, 2 steps and the bow is in my hand, from this position I can spin, transition into another striking combo, go into some type of pose, whatever it is that I need to do next. So there are the basics of the vertical release technique and why it's important to push the bow up off of the thumb. The next thing that we're going to cover is the box cutter. And the box cutter technique is typically the lob of bow staff, right? We talked about with the quarterback analogy, lobbing the football up over the defense. This is the lob of the bow staff throws. So for a box cutter, you're going to want to make sure, if you're following along, you want to make sure you got plenty of space, particularly to your right side. So when you're assuming you're a right-handed thrower, you want to make sure there's nothing off to your right that you're going to be able to hit. Your start position, you're going to start about a forearm's distance from the tip of the bow. Some people, like myself, like to be a little bit higher than that, but the standard is about a forearm's distance from the tip. So you'll see me choke up just a little bit above that. Now I'm going to take that long end of the bow, and I'm going to put it down on my left hip. This is my chamber for the technique. Once I get the bow to my left hip, these are the steps. I'm going to bring the bow across my body as I extend this right arm. And notice that as I do that, I'm going to start to let my wrist rotate. And what I'm looking for as the practitioner is I'm looking for this shorter end of the bow to pass under my forearm. Whenever that shorter end of the bow passes under my forearm, that's my cue to do 2 things. Lift and pull. Repeat after me. Lift and pull. Those are the 2 things that you have to do to get that box cutter to have the proper motion. So I'm bringing it across my body, I'm waiting for that short end to get under my forearm, and then here's what I mean by lift and pull. When I get over to that, about that right corner is where the short end should pass under your forearm. I'm going to lift my arm up, and I'm going to pull my arm back as I let go. The lift is going to get the bow up into the air over my head so it doesn't hit me in the head, and the pull is what's going to give me the rotation of the bow coming around horizontally. So if you watch me as slow motion as I can, it'll be from here, across the body, lift, pull. Notice I lift and pull. That right hand continues to kind of come back to my left shoulder. I watch the bow complete 1 full rotation, and then I make my catch. Now you'll notice that when I did the vertical release, I was waiting on the bow to come to me. I was using a palm up catch, and I was receiving the bow very gently, right? But when I'm doing the box cutter, I have to intercept the motion of the bow a little bit, but be very careful never to slap down at your bow. That's a really good way to knock your bow or knock your weapon. You can do the same box cutter technique with a sword, with a comma, with a nunchuck, doesn't matter. But if you're swiping at your weapon, if you're slapping your weapon, you're more likely to hit it to the ground than you are to actually catch it. So what you want to do is you want to use what I call a frisbee catch, right? You just leave that hand open just like this, and then as the bow comes into the hand, boom, you catch it just like you would a frisbee. Just folding that hand right on top, you make that catch, and then you can go down to your pose or your swing or your next strike combo or whatever it may be, right? So we start from the left side, forearms distance from the tip. You can measure that out, forearms distance from the tip. It's on the left hip, bringing the bow across the body all the way until the short end goes under my forearm, and then I lift and pull. Lifting and pulling at the same time gives me that rotation. I'm nice and patient. I let the bow come down to me. Now, if you have some trouble getting the bow above your head, you have some trouble getting that rotation, it's perfectly okay to start with a half rotation. Starting from the left hip, you can bring the bow across your body, extending the right arm, and then I just do a little lift and a little pull. A little lift and a little pull has me switch ends of the bow, and this is a great drill. I can just stay stationary and keep lifting and pulling a little bit and switching ends of the bow just like that. That's a great way to build hand-eye coordination, to develop confidence with this technique, because you're not going to be messing that up very much. So that's an excellent drill that you can do to get started. And then once you're comfortable with that lift and pull, you just lift a little bit higher and pull a little bit harder. That's going to allow you to get that full rotation and be able to make that catch. So there's another technique. Now we're going to jump back into strategy once again. There's another type of horizontal releasing technique that I innovated and created several variations of that you see a lot in competition today. Now, I didn't invent the zero gravity itself, but I was the first person to ever do a 360 zero gravity in competition, throwing the bow up horizontally from behind my back, rotating catch. Did it for the first time in the 2011 US Open. Fun fact of it. But anyway. So the zero gravity is the other method for throwing the bow above our head, the other kind of lob throwing technique where the bow is spinning a little bit slower and I have some options for what I can do while the bow is in the air. So now I'm going to let you brainstorm for a second once again as my audience. Why would I want to do a zero gravity for certain techniques, and why would I want to do a box cutter for other techniques? Look at the main differences in those two moves besides the throw technique, right? Here's the zero gravity. Obviously, it's a throw from behind my back. Here's the box cutter. Obviously, it's a throw that happens in front of me. But what are the two different uses that I could use those for? What is the thing that makes my catch different? I'll let you brainstorm that for a second. Thank you for the like. I saw that like come through, whoever that was. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and give you the answer now that you've had some time to think over it, right? Notice that the zero gravity is a move that goes directly above my head, while the box cutter is a move that goes out in front of me. So there's two different uses for these moves. A box cutter, which goes out in front of me, that's going to be a lot easier to add spinning upgrades to, because I don't want the bow to be directly above my head while I'm spinning to catch it. Sure, I can do that. I already demonstrated a 360 zero gravity. But when you're first starting to get horizontal rotation with the spin of your body, it's going to be a lot easier to have the box cutter out in front of you. You can spin, spot the bow out in front, and then be able to step in and make that catch. It also, notice how I had to step in for that catch, it also facilitates very good movement. So let's say I start on one end of the frame once again, the bow's out away from me, I throw, spin to the bow, I'm already getting some movement halfway across the ring. Maybe once I rotate out of that catch, I can get the rest of my movement to finish that transition across the ring. So most of my spinning techniques will happen with the horizontal box cutter throw. But the zero gravity is what I'm going to use for a lot more techniques that I use to control momentum. And this is where we're going to get to kind of the penultimate technique of the session today, which is the Criss Angel, one of probably my most famous signature moves that I performed in competition. So zero gravity, as we mentioned, rotates pretty much directly above my head. Maybe just ever so slightly in front of me, but for the most part, above my head. The point of the Criss Angel, which I'll go ahead and demonstrate that move for you real quick. Throwing the bow up, catching on the back of my hand, and balancing as I come all the way across the front. If you add a little bit more precision to that, you can actually do the mind freak, where you're catching on just one finger and bringing that across the front. One of my favorite signature moves. So in order to do that, I have to master, what's kind of funny is I have to master Einstein's theory of relativity, right? And you might be thinking, oh no, college physics, right? That's hard stuff. Don't worry about it. I'm going to make it super simple, right? So the illusion of this move is that it looks like the bow is just stopping on the back of my hand, right? But really, the bow's not stopping. The bow continues to move, right? So in a vacuum, right, I say like, oh, part of what's impressive is the bow's in the air and then it stops on the back of my hand. But notice, my hand isn't stopped. My hand is moving. Now this may seem trivial, but stay with me here, right? When the bow goes up into the air, the bow is doing two things. The bow is rotating and it is falling. As I do it in the air, so what goes up must come down, gravity, right? So the bow is rotating and falling. So in order for me to control the momentum of the bow, I have to do exactly what the bow does. I have to fall and I have to rotate. So notice when I make that catch, what's happening is I'm bending my knees and I'm rotating. My knees bend, so I'm falling with the bow, and I rotate. So even though the bow continues to move, the bow stops relative to me. And this is where we get into theory of relativity, right? Right now, when I throw the bow up in the air for the first time, I throw the bow. While that bow is up in the air, it is moving relative to you, the viewer, and it is moving relative to me. We both see that the bow is moving. However, the moment that the bow touches my hand, and I am falling and spinning with the bow, because the bow and I have the exact same motion, the bow is no longer moving relative to me. To me, when I look at the bow is still, because I am moving along with the bow. However, to the viewer, to you, the audience, the bow is still moving. But because myself and the bow are moving at the same speed, it appears as if the bow has stopped. Does that make sense? So that's how we kind of use the theory of relativity, which is a kind of complicated physics thing developed by Albert Einstein, and we can use that to explain why this move kind of has like a magic effect, that it looks like it's just stopping on the back of my hand. So how do you actually do this technique? That was a lot of really cool like scientific stuff, but how do we actually do it? Well, the way that I like to do this technique is using a learning method that I call the stepping stone method. Stepping stone method means that you're going to start with a very base level of the trick that you're probably going to succeed at, and then you start to build on top of it. So I'm going to go ahead and take you through the stepping stones to master the Criss Angel. The first stepping stone is to understand how to control the bow on the backs of your hands. So if you've got your bow with you, hold it out in front of you, and just put the bow on the backs of both hands just like so. This first stepping stone technique is what I call the pizza toss, because we're going to take the bow from that left side. Notice that we're going from the left side to the right, much like we did with the box cutter to create that rotation, right? So we have the bow on the backs of both hands. I'm going to bring that bow across my body, keeping it at a comfortable level, not super high, not super low, just about in the middle. Keeping the bow at a comfortable level, I bring the bow across my body, and I'm going to lift both arms up as I pull my right hand back and push my left hand forward. If I pull my right hand back and push my left hand forward at the same time, that gives me rotation that I can then catch with that frisbee catch. So even though we're now using a throw with the back of our hands instead of a catch with the back of our hands, this is great for getting you acclimated to controlling the bow without actually holding it. Controlling the bow with just the back of your hands. That's level one, the pizza toss. Level two is to try to then catch the pizza toss on the back of your hands once again. So you start on the backs of both hands, you bring the bow across the body, pull your right hand back and push your left hand forward, and that gives you the throw, and then boom. Now I'm using two hands, so I don't have to mimic the rotation of the bow, because when the bow hits my two hands, it'll just stop. But I do have to absorb the shock of that bow hitting my hands, otherwise it'll just bounce off. So I do have to bend my knees as I make contact with the bow once again. And the goal is to avoid this. You don't want it to look like this. You don't want one of these where the bow starts to roll up one of your arms. You want to make sure your arms stay nice on an even plane and your hands stay nice and parallel when you do the throw so that the bow rotates nice and parallel and you can control once again on the backs of the hands. That's level two. Level three is to try to go from two hands to one hand. So I'm going to throw the bow off the backs of my hands once again, turning my hips. Right hand pulls back, left hand pushes forward. I land on both hands, but notice this time I'm trying to land my right hand more in the middle of the bow and the left hand more off to one side just for support. So now I landed on two hands. I continue rotating and take my left hand off, trying to balance just on the right. So that's level three. Once again, back of both hands. Then I go catch with both hands, and then I take the left hand away, trying to kind of wean the bow over to my right hand, get my right hand more used to controlling the bow. And then once we've got it from two hands onto one hand, then you just go from the throw directly onto the one hand. Now you should be comfortable controlling the bow with the back of your hands. So you start from the left, rotate, push, and then you can make that catch on the back of one hand. The slower the bow is rotating, the more difficult this move is. Now that doesn't mean that you're trying to spin the bow at full speed, because that won't work either. But if I do, let's say I use the zero gravity setup and there's barely any rotation, it's going to be really hard to control the bow because I have no momentum for my body to follow. I want the bow to get above my head and have some good rotation to it, just about like that, so that that is momentum that I can capture and let my body allow to bring around with me. So don't allow yourself to go too slow. That will just make this more difficult. You want to be getting one full rotation of the bow on every variation of this technique. Then, if you want to try to get the mind freak, which as I mentioned earlier is the catch on the back of one finger, you can do the exact same series of moves starting on the back of 2 fingers, right? Exact same skills. We can push up, land it on the back of both fingers, just like that. We can push up, try to land on one finger. So you can do the exact same progression of moves for the mind freak or the one finger catch. You can do the exact same progression that you did for the Criss Angel using the backs of the hands. Now the last question that you're probably left with is, that's great that we can do those stepping stone moves, but how do we actually do the zero gravity? How do you actually throw it from behind your back and get it to rotate parallel to the ground? And that's the last thing that we're going to cover here today. So, my start position. I'm going to be a little bit below the center of the bow, and when I say a little bit below the center, I mean about a fist distance. So if my hand's in the middle, I go 1 fist distance and grab just below the center of the bow right there. Now I'm going to start with my right hand in this middle block position, and I'm going to rotate the bow horizontally. This is very important. I want to rotate the bow horizontally as I bring it down to my hip so that I set that precedent. I need to make sure that the bow is nice and flat when it gets to my hip. If the bow's at an angle when it gets to that right hip, my throw is almost certainly going to be on an angle, and if my throw's on an angle, it's going to be extremely difficult to catch on the back of my hand trying to get to the Criss Angel upgrade, right? So what I want to do is I want to start with the bow flat so that when I go behind the back, I remember to have the bow nice and flat. Now, a lot of people think that the rotation of this move comes from a flick of my wrist behind my back, and that could not be more untrue. A flick of the wrist from behind my back will simply take me into a body roll, right? The way that I do a body roll from behind my back is I flick my wrist, which pulls the bow into my body, as you can see there, and that gives me a technique called an anti-gravity. That is a unique move that is different, that is a roll, it is not a throw. So in order to get the throw, you do not want to use your wrist to get rotation at all. In fact, all of the rotation on a zero gravity comes from the turning of your hips. So notice, I'm square to the front right here, I rotate down, boom, and I stop. 2 things. Number 1, I want to fully extend this right elbow. I fully extend that right elbow so the bow gets all the way down below my body. Number 2 is that hip rotation I was talking about. So I keep this left hand up and out of the way, and I'm going to pivot my left foot and turn that left hip all the way in. Now look at this. Because that right arm is extended, and because I've turned that hip all the way in, I have this beautiful lane for the bow to go up on. This bow has all kinds of space on my back side for it to travel up. If I had not turned my hips and I left my hips like this, the bow could hit my elbow. It's much more congested. If I turn my hips with my arm extended, I've got a ton of space for that bow to go up, which is a beautiful thing because that's what's going to allow the bow to rotate. Now, if I get to this position and stop, and then I just pull this elbow up straight, when I push, the bow's just going to go above my head. There's not going to be any rotation. Once again, going back to the theme that we've covered here multiple times, there's no momentum. In order for the bow to rotate, there has to be momentum. So if I go here and stop, I lose my momentum. The bow doesn't rotate when I push it up in the air. However, one of the most difficult parts of this move is getting it to go up above your head. So the first drill that I recommend for someone that's never done this before is to use that same setup. Bow to the hip, nice and flat, extend the arm, turn the hips in and stop, and then just practice pulling that bow up and catching it after it goes above your head. That's a great way to get more comfortable getting the bow up over your head, developing the right muscles for your arm to be used to that. Now, once you get the bow up over your head, you're going to want that rotation. All you have to do is turn the hips at the same time that you bring the elbow up behind your back. If I turn my hips and bring my elbow up at the same time, that gives me my rotation, that gives me a beautiful zero gravity. Now, one thing that you have to remember is just because you follow those steps doesn't mean it's going to be perfect on the first try. This is a technique that takes a lot of time to get down because this is a motion that's very unnatural. There's nothing in everyday life that your body has to do that motion for, right? And so what you want to do is start with a smaller object. This is how I taught myself how to do the move. Start with a tennis ball, a water bottle, some balled up socks, a shoe, whatever, right? Start with a small object and just try to throw that up from behind your back. Start with something little that's not going to make you uncomfortable and just try to see if you can get that up over your head. Then you move on to that step that I talked about with your bow where you're trying to pop the bow up over your head, and then eventually you can work your way up to turning your hips and bending that right elbow and boom, getting that zero gravity above the head. Once you have the zero gravity above the head, you can follow the exact same steps that we talked about from that pizza toss, controlling the bow in the back of your hand. Square your hips up, bend. You want to fall and rotate just as the bow is falling and rotating, and that will give you your Criss Angel bow. And you can control the bow with only the back of your hand. Now there is one more thing. And now we just learned another technique. So I noticed that this workshop is titled Strategies and Techniques with Jackson Rudolph, right? So the strategy here. Notice that when I first performed the Criss Angel, whether you go back to the video of me at Warrior Cup in 2013 performing it, or when I just demonstrated for you guys in this live stream, whenever I perform the Criss Angel, I almost always throw the bow to the back so that I can bring the bow around to the front. And why is that? Well, if I throw the bow to the front, then what's going to happen is by the time that I catch the bow, the majority of the move is being shown to the back, which is not what I want. My audience and my judges are in front of me. So I chose to angle that move starting to the back so that when I made contact with the back of my hand, the showcase part of the move would be coming to the front. Now, the other side of that would be, well, why don't you just spin all the way around? Why don't you just throw to the front so they see the catch and then continue that spin all the way this way? Whenever a move drags on too long, it loses some of its effect. You want a cool move to last about a second or two and nothing more than that, right? When I first started performing this move in competition, a lot of people tried to get it down and tried to put it in their forms as well. And the one reason that nobody ever really got the same effect that I did is A, because they didn't make it up, and B, because they were doing this, where they would catch it and then they would just kind of spin around like this. And they're just kind of spinning around like this. And once you've got the bow balanced, everybody gets it. Like they know you can balance the bow on the back of your hand, so you don't have to keep doing it. Just be done with it, right? So when you're doing an impressive move, do it just long enough to show it off, but not long enough for it to get old. That's a very, very important part of your strategy. So on this one, even though it may seem unconventional to throw the bow going away from the crowd, away from the judges, they still see the bow go up over my head. They still see the bow go in the air. And next thing you know, I've got the bow on the back of my hand, showing it off to the front. No magic about it, just a martial arts technique using basic physics and basic science to be able to master the momentum of that bow and controlling it going across the back of the hand. Now, my last note that I'll leave you guys with is I mentioned when talking about the people that would try the Criss Angel and not do it right, one of the reasons was because they continued to do the move and they let it get old, right? And the other reason was because they weren't the ones that made it up. There's two sides to this. Number one, I am honored and I am very impressed when people take my moves and put them in their forms. It's the greatest form of flattery. I love it when kids do it. I even love it when some of my peers do it because I enjoy that I've had that much impact for somebody to want to do that move. But what I appreciate a lot more is when somebody takes that move and puts their own spin on it, finds a new way to do it, finds a different variation that doesn't make it my move, but makes it their own, right? In general, I don't have any problem with biting. If you want to learn the Criss Angel and put exactly the Criss Angel in your form, that's great, that's awesome. However, just know that when you do it, the judges are probably going to think, oh, that's Jackson's move, right? So instead what you could do is, don't just take the skill that I taught you today and leave it at that, right? I want you to take the skill that I taught you today and take it to another level. Be creative, find something new that you can do with it, right? Instead of just doing the Criss Angel and bringing it across, maybe you can take it up into another throw. Just like I did with my own move. I said, okay, well now I've got it mastered with the back of my hand. Maybe now I can upgrade it to catching on my finger, right? So always try to find something. When you're inspired by a move, when you're inspired by an athlete or a martial arts competitor, if you see something that you like, don't just take it. Take it first so that you can understand it, and then try to do something that makes it your own. Because in the history of sport karate, there's never been somebody that spent their whole career imitating and became one of the all-time greats. You always have to find the something that makes it you, that makes your form you. You want to find something that stands out, and you want your routines to express who you are. This is the art part of martial arts, is the self-expression and the creativity that comes with creating, especially an extreme, musical, creative, open, whatever you want to call it, weapons routine. So the message that I'll leave you with is, I would love for you to learn all of the techniques that I've done. But if you stop there, you probably won't achieve greatness. What I want you to do is I want you to take those techniques to the next level. I always say that when I train somebody, I don't want to train you to be as good as me. I want to train you to be better than me. Because if you get better than me, that's what's going to keep our sport moving forward, and that's what I want to see, right? When it's 10 years from now and I'm not competing actively anymore and I'm watching YouTube, I don't want to go on and see all the same moves that I did 15 years ago. I want to see all the new moves, people changing the sport, and that's what's going to get our sport to continue to grow. And there's nothing that would make me happier than to see this sport get onto a major stage, be something that's on ESPN all the time, our athletes become paid athletes. That's exactly the vision that I have for this sport. And that only happens if all of you continue training hard, continue to be yourself, and continue to take your skills to the next level, not just imitating. I'm Jackson Rudolph. If you're interested in private lessons, seminars, feel free to contact me individually. I am doing webinars since everything has gone online for the COVID-19 pandemic. And in addition, I also have a weapons curriculum called The Flow System. Visit theflowsystem.tv if you want to implement weapons training into your school. We have a complete bow staff curriculum featuring myself, as well as a common curriculum featuring the great Mackenzie Emery. So thank you all very much for your time. If you enjoyed this session, please feel free to go ahead and hit that share button. Thank you very much to Point Fighter Live and Alex Reyes for having me on for this section. Power, baby. Much appreciated. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, and I'll see you guys next time. Hopefully we get to this again soon. I'm Jackson Rudolph, and everybody have a great day. Stay safe.